The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the Blue Marble Desktop webinar. Currently, all participants are in a listen-only mode. And at this time, you should be able to see the welcome screen with the Blue Marble logo. If you need assistance or have connectivity issues during the presentation, please send an email to feedback@bluemarblegeo.com. Our support team will reply to you promptly. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can use the questions tool at the right of the GoToWebinar screen to submit questions to our panelists. We will field some of them as we go and address more at the end of the presentation. Depending on the volume of questions, we will follow up with email at the end for any remaining questions. You can always email our support team at geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com at any time. Today's demonstration is approximately 60 minutes in duration. Welcome, everyone. Today's webinar will be covering the soon-to-be-released tools dedicated to seismic data conversion in Blue Marble Desktop 2.4. This new job will increase the flexibility and the ease of converting UCOA, SEG-P1, and SPS formats. Through a new interface, users will be able to easily convert coordinates for both shot point and receiver records in a single process, as well as convert both geodetic and projected coordinates in one run, all the while aligning the columns to the proper format. At the end of the demonstration today, we will leave time for live questions and answers. And if you would like further in-depth training on any of these tools, you can always contact your Blue Marble sales rep at sales@bluemarblegeo.com. And at this time, I would like to introduce Sam Knight, our Director of Product Management.
Thank you, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Danielle mentioned, today we're going to be focusing on seismic data conversion in the Blue Marble Desktop, specifically in version 2.4, which is our upcoming release. We're going to be releasing that shortly here during the winter, so keep an eye out for that. Within the Blue Marble Desktop, we have traditionally had support in the past for various types of seismic data. Included in that, we've had some tools for working with SEG-P1 files, UCOA formats, SPS. You've been able to define your own ASCII scheme to bring in various versions of that. But there have been some limitations on certain functions, particularly in relation to the point database conversions job. Some folks may be familiar with this job. This is where we typically handle our seismic data conversions, any of our regular spreadsheet conversions, any sorts of ASCII data, folks that work with GPS data that's streaming in from a GPS device connected to your PC. All sorts of those data formats can be stored as text files and then brought into the point database conversion. In this interface, it's a really powerful interface. It's been the workhorse of the Blue Marble Desktop for many, many years. We see an example here of doing a simple Excel sheet conversion in the point database tab. So we have a couple of columns of coordinate data, and then there's some attribute data that is located presumably at the positions that we've stored in our spreadsheet. Now, 4 simple columns here that we might have for some very simple data really is not a good example of some of the complexities of the formats that we deal with in seismic data conversion. So I've got another example down at the bottom here with our sort of classical form of the point database conversion with a SEG-P1 file loaded up into it. So we break it out into the 15 columns that are present in a SEG-P1 file. And specifically, this is a SEG-P190 file. I know some folks are probably interested in the handling of SEG-P111, the upcoming standard for SEG data. We will be planning to support that when it does come out. At this time, since it's not a finalized specification, we don't have that in the job, but we will be adopting it as soon as it does become standard. So the data that I've got right here is a fairly typical SEG-P190 file. So what we have are some columns of the various bits and pieces of data. We see C5 and C6, we have some coordinate data that's in the packed up format that we work with for latitude and longitude. And in this particular format, I'm missing the northings and eastings that are stored in the 7th and 8th columns, or specifically the easting and the northing, rather, that are stored in those columns. Now, SEG is somewhat of a simple format compared to some of the different seismic types, and specifically the SEG P1. All of the columns are in the same place. So it's a fixed width text scheme, so we know how many characters are in each column, and we can easily break it up in that sense. There are both room for shot point and receiver data in there. There's also a header at the beginning of the file that gives us the information that we need to break apart the coordinates, figure out what coordinate system they're in, and make our conversions to actually go about doing the work that we're interested in doing with these seismic files. Now, again, SEG is a fairly simple place to work. Some of the limitations that we've had in here is that we can only operate on one set of columns at a time. So for those of you that are familiar with converting point database files in here, you'll be familiar with the column settings button that we typically use in here to specify where our input columns are going to be and where our output columns are going to be, depending on whether we're going to be getting our coordinates from the latitude and longitude columns in here, or if we're going to be getting those coordinates in the projected forms. Most of the time, a lot of folks are going to be working with UTM coordinates as the projected form of the coordinates in there. The limitation on being only able to work with one single set of coordinates at a time really is only a problem when we're dealing with very large volumes of data. And particularly, some of these SEG files, as we start plotting all of the various shot points throughout the file, we deal with files that have somewhere between a couple thousand points, ranging all the way up into files that have millions and millions of points in them. So the file I've got here, just as an example, has about 1,500 coordinates in it. It's a relatively small file. And I can complete a conversion on this simply by specifying those columns in just a few seconds. It doesn't take very long to do that. When we start dealing with volumes of coordinates, getting up into the millions, if we want to convert both the coordinates that are in the latitude and longitude columns as well as the coordinates that are in our northing and easting columns, that's where it starts taking a little bit longer. We have to run that file through twice and do two different conversions on the job. In some of the more complex formats, such as those of you who are used to working with the UKO format, the UKOA P190 format, that's another file that is really rather similar in the data that it contains and the structure, how they're stored. We've got shot points, we've got receiver records for this seismic data, and they're not always in the same place. That's the big trouble with dealing with UKOA format. So if we try to load in a UKOA file, we run into trouble in actually using that column settings dialog. And this should be something familiar to anybody that's worked with UKOA data. We've only got one place where we can specify our input coordinates and one place we can specify our output coordinates. But in the forms of UKOA data, we can't rely on those being in the same place. So with those limitations of having multiple columns of coordinates that sometimes depend on each other for their coordinate system information, the base data information, as well as having multiple column structures. So from row to row, we don't always have the same information, depending on if we're talking about a shot point or if we're talking about a receiver record. So that's where we started exploring some new functions here. And so the software we're looking at is Blue Marble Desktop. It should look familiar to anybody that's working with Desktop 2.3 or even any of the previous versions. There aren't any major structural changes here. But what we're looking at today is the addition of this new job that we have, and that we're calling a seismic survey conversion. So this is really a special case of the point database job. And this is going to bring forward some new tools that allow us to more speedily work with UKOA data, with SEG P190 data, and as well the SPX format. So first, you'll notice when we load this stuff in here, we actually show all of these different bits and pieces. At the top of the screen, we have these white cells at the top, and you'll see they have all of the various identifiers that we use to identify some of the different shot point data that we have. Down a little farther, you'll see in that first column here, we're tagging the receiver records. So the receiver records all start with an R, and our various shot, the nav of this file, all has different letters identifying what that row happens to have. Now, the structure of the data, we can actually see, if you're not familiar with these, the shot points are storing their coordinates over here in the 8th and 9th column. Scroll over a little bit to make that clear. In the 8th and 9th column, we have our latitudes and we have our longitudes. And then in C10, we have our eastings, so those are projected coordinates, and we have our northings, and those are also the other half of the projected coordinates. So we have latitude, longitude, northings, and eastings, and then farther down in our receiver record, we have not just one set of coordinates, but we have sets of northings and eastings in the 3rd and 4th columns, in the 7th and 8th columns, and then over here in the 11th and 12th columns. So that's a lot of different places we have coordinate data. And if we want to simply run this all in one pass, so let's say, for example, we want to update both the latitude and longitudes and the projected coordinates for the shot points, and update the projected coordinates for the receiver records, all in one pass, that takes a fairly different interface than we do with just picking one single set of columns at a time. This has been something that folks have been asking for quite a while now on the desktop, to be able to have the flexibility to work with all of these different column structures, particularly in UCOA format, and as well on the others to be able to handle multiple conversions in one pass. So back in the seg file format, speaking specifically about the formats that have two sets of coordinates, the shot points and the receivers, all have the same structure, but converting both the lat longs and the projected coordinates in one. So this is the new interface, and we're going to be taking a look at some of the specifics of this interface, how we load the data in, how we set up the conversions, and taking a look at just some of the bits and pieces of either doing these in a one-off mode, where if we have a particular file that doesn't quite follow full specification, or if we have data that is a little bit more clean, or if we just simply have localized variants on some of these. So there's some new options that build upon some of our existing tools. Now, to start this off, I'm going to do a simpler example of a seismic survey conversion in here using that same seg file that I started with up in my seg P1 job that I've been showing for a while now. So in the data conversion, up at the top of the screen there, we're going to add our file just like we normally would. So I've got two example files here, and I have a seg P1 example and a UCOA P190 example that we're going to work through. So I'm going to open my seg P1 file, and we have a new prompt that comes up. So when we load in these files, there are existing standards. So if we have a completely standard file, we can load this in without a whole lot of headache. And if you're used to working with data that is all following that common format, we can actually choose the preference to not show this dialog again and just go ahead and always assume that we're working with a nice clean file. For those of you that are a little more familiar with working with this, the reality of the situation is that there is a lot of different variation that we bump into in any of those formats, the SEG and the UCOA formats, the SPS. Various folks manipulate these things over the years, and we find that the columns aren't in the right place, the headers have been corrupted in various ways, and so there's almost no such thing as a standard seg file as we start working through these. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load this in. I'm going to say yes. Let's just go ahead and use that existing scheme to bring this file in. So we're going to assume that this data is nice and clean and it follows all of the standards for working with this type of data. It looks like all of my data has actually come in fairly clean. We can see our line names. We can see the shot point numbers indicated there. All of the various codes and bits and pieces that we see across the various columns of the SEG data. Now, one thing you're going to notice at the top is the labels that we bring in here. So these labels we actually get right out of the standards for these files. So we know exactly what should be in columns 1 through 15. So we're now adding those labels on there. This isn't something we used to do. So this is a little, just a time saver for those of you that are doing a lot of these. It very clearly marks out where the latitude is, where the longitude is, and the easting and northing as well. So I have my lats and longs here. I'm missing my eastings and northings, so we might want to update those. But let's just check out the header before we get into that. Now the header looks like it's also brought in, fairly normally. We see all the typical expected information up there in the header. But the trouble is, when I get down to the bottom of the header, we can see that I've actually got some data, some actual data records are being brought in as the header. So there's something not quite right with this file. And this is one of the more common things we see where header formatting gets a little bit messed up. And so if we go ahead and convert this file, we're actually going to be missing a piece of the data. Looks like we've got probably somewhere around 15 or 20 rows up at the top of that are actually getting sucked into the header that shouldn't really be there. So, okay, that's not going to work for us. What I'm going to do is reload this file, grab right onto that same file, and this time when it asks me if I want to follow the standard for loading this file in, I'm going to say no. And this is going to bring us into an interface that might look a little bit familiar to those of you who are used to working with our ASCII data formats. So in the past, we've had a text scheme wizard that we've used for SegP1, UCOA, SPS, but also some of the more plain vanilla formats like CSV and TSV, so comma-separated and tab-separated values. Some folks are used to working with this for XYZ data or various other formats. This is actually a modified version of this that we've streamlined specifically for the seismic format. In the type dropdown, folks have been used to seeing a number of file formats in there that encompass all of the non-seismic types as well. So this is, like I said, a streamlined version of our text wizard designed specifically for the specifics of handling shot point and receiver data. Now, we start off with three basic types of files that we've got in here, the SegP1, the UCOA P190, and the SPS. And these are all existing standards according to the actual specification that you can download from the various organizations that maintain these. Now, if we have a number of files that are going to be, following a similar non-true form of the spec, we can actually create these permanently. There's two ways to work through this. We can either not bother saving what we're doing. We can simply just go through, do a one-off, or there's also another interface that's going to allow us to make these permanent if we want to add a permanent variation on one of these formats. So we're going to take a look at doing this both ways. So first, I'm just going to use the base SegP1 format, and we're going to step through this. So it loads in the preview of the file that you just specified. So here's the top chunk of that file, specifying the headers in there. And you'll see there's an H on every column, or rather there's an H starting off every row indicating the header. And that's a little bit funny for these files. There's, according to the specification, there's only actually supposed to be an H on every 20th row. So what we're going to do here is move on to the next screen where we interact with the header record. So you'll see our normal specification is set to expect each header record to begin with an H, but there's this idea of what they call a logical block. And a logical block, just essentially, it's a computer file storage term, and it basically just means a number of rows that are going to be tagged in here with those H's. So if our block length is, for example, here 20, according to the normal SEG specification, there should only be an H on every 20th row, which is fine when it works. But in this case, this file was created a little bit differently, and somebody slapped an H on the front of every row. And so what happens here, as we get down into the bottom of our highlighted area, so all the yellow data is being recognized as actual header data rather than coordinate data, you'll see it's grabbing these top rows. So that last H there before our data actually begins is overlapping, and it's going down 20 rows, and that's what's sucking in the bits and pieces of our coordinate data. So that's no good for us here. We need to slightly modify this on really just on a one-time deal for bringing this data in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my block length. So the block length is simply a number of lines past that last H. So I'm going to set my block length to 1. And when I do that, we'll see the header is only going to isolate every individual row that has that H up front, and it stops right where my data begins. So for my one-off scheme here, that's working fine for me. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next screen. And the next screen, this is where it starts looking a little bit different from our regular text scheme wizard for the seismic types. We'll see our typical option is that the data starts after the header, and that we can isolate different record types in here. We can isolate shot points and receivers. If those columns are not all in the same structure, we can actually put those in different places. In this case, all of my data does simply fall after the header. You'll see it highlights it for us down there. And there are little red lines here on the screen exactly where our column breaks are going to be. So in the field lengths area on this, we'll see the number of fields is locked in at 15. That is simply part of the SEG specification. So if you want to line these things up, you've got to have 15 columns somewhere in this file. Now, the length of those is also specifically designed according to the spec. But one of the things that happens to these is offsets get introduced. The columns aren't always the same width. They're not always written quite in the right place. And so sometimes we need to doctor where those columns happen to be. One of the things we've recently added to this, and this is something that's not present in 2.3, it's the same style interface with the red lines here, is a drag and drop change to locate these columns in a different place. So I'm simply putting my cursor over one of those red lines and clicking on it, and I can drag that to wherever I like if I need to relocate where those column breaks actually take place. So in this case, my columns are all actually in the right place, but if they were, say, adjusted one in a different direction, I could simply bump those over and adjust them to bring in the data into the appropriate places in those 15 columns. Now, those are really the only settings we have here for bringing this data in. All of the columns are in the same structure here in my SEG file. We'll get a little bit more complicated when we take a look at the UCOA data, as we have different shot and receiver records. So I'm going to go ahead and finish, and in this case, when I say finish, it's actually going to reload that data into the job for conversion. So now if we take a look at our header, when we go to the bottom of our header, we're going to see that now we just have header data, and we don't anymore have those data records at the bottom of our header. So we can go ahead and simply make the updates to our header if we're going to be doing an actual conversion in here, if we're going to be doing something like changing a datum or changing the coordinate system, the projected coordinate system that we're working with for these things. So the conversion itself is also a little bit different in here. So now I mentioned that we have both latitude and longitude and easting and northing columns in here. Part of the SEG specification defines exactly which columns contain those pieces of data. So we've been able to make the interface a little bit smarter here for actually dealing with this. So I've got some latitude and longitudes, and I'm missing my eastings and northings. So one thing I might want to do here is simply fill in my eastings and northings based on those original lats and longs. So now I can go into my header, like we've always been able to do this. Go into the header, we can scroll down to the bottom, and we can find that base datum that's being used in here. So in this case, we're being identified as WGS84, and through this is one of our nice little goofs that we see in these files all the time, is it identifies zone 38 in UTM as being part of our datum. So those of us that see a lot of these things, we know that we're just after the WGS84 part of that. So what we're going to do is set our input coordinate system to WGS84 using our standard coordinate system control here. I'm just going to double click on that input system, and I'm going to find WGS84 under my geodetics list here. So all my geodetic coordinate systems are found in there. I'm just going to scroll down, find WGS84, and make that selection. We come back to our main interface. So I've got WGS84 lat long as my input. Now, because we only have room for one lat-long set of coordinates in here, when you set this to a geodetic coordinate system, it already knows that we're talking about our latitude and longitude columns. We don't actually have to bring up the column settings dialog to specify that. And you'll actually notice the column settings dialog is missing from this interface. On the output side as well, we don't need to use the column settings dialog that we have taken away. We don't need that in order to finish the conversion, because we know where any projected coordinates are going to go, and we know where any geodetic coordinates are going to go. So we have two coordinate systems now listed on the output side of things here. And so for those of you who may be less familiar with that, having two output coordinate systems is different from the older ways of doing things. So I'm going to click over here real quick, just back to our original seg job. You'll see we have just one coordinate system on each side for our existing point database conversion job. So now on our new job type, we have two output coordinate systems, one projected and one geodetic. What this allows us to do is simply check them on or off for which piece of this we're going to be working with. So in this case, if I check off my output projected coordinate system, it will fill in my eastings and northings. And if I also check off my output geodetics, it's going to change the lat-long coordinate system to whatever lat-long we're going to be basing this on for output. One restriction here is that those must be based on the same datum. That is really just sort of common sense to have those on the same datum for output here. So in this case, I'm only interested in populating my UTM coordinates. If we had some formatting issue on the lat and the long, we might want to overwrite those and put those into the appropriate format. And we could do that just the same as before. So my input is WGS84 lat long. My output is going to be UTM zone 38. And so I'll simply find Universal Transverse Mercator Zone 38 North in my list of UTM zones. And then we're free to go on to our conversionist to actually preview this and process the output. And I have a leftover file name down here for my file type. This is one of the last things I was working with was a UKO conversion. So what I'm going to do here is just simply make a new file name. I'm going to call my file segp1, and I'm going to save this out as a segp1 file. So when I save that out, we'll see the file we're going to create. And then we have the option to preview and process our conversion. So if I preview our conversion, we can find out our little process manager pops up at the bottom here. We can see some of the previous jobs. Those the error state is left over from some previous jobs that I was playing around with earlier. But my latest job in there goes to a green status. It's finished with that preview. So it fills in for us over here our easting and our northing. So one of the things I've noticed here in my easting and northing on my preview, we call this a preview because we're not actually running the entire file yet. This is just an on-screen preview. In here, I've added two places of decimal precision on my projected output. Now, one of the very common things in here is no decimal precision. A lot of times we work with whole units in here. And so I might want to correct that before I actually go and finish off my, my whole conversion. So what I can do is, since we're just working on screen here, I can double check my format on my output projected coordinates. I can see that my grid coordinates are set to a decimal precision of 2. If I wish to bump that down to a whole unit, I can bump that down to 0 there. If I want to work with whole meters, I can OK those settings, and then I can go right back to the preview button. And I can run that on-screen preview again. Now it's going to round off all those coordinates for me. So that looks a little better for my conversion. That sounds like I've done what I'm after here. So at this point, I can actually go ahead and process the whole file. And that, in this case, only takes just a second longer there because I'm working with a relatively small file. This can all go in one pass. But again, if we're working with those very heavy files that contain millions of records, what we're going to run into is that some of those things actually do take a little bit of time to convert, particularly if we start talking about batches. We want to be making sure that we've previewed the conversion on our job such that we don't get unexpected results after we've spent a lot of time running a big batch, only to come back and find out that we've set our formats wrong up front. Now, as well, on this new job, you'll also notice the metadata button. And the metadata button, for those of you who are working on a desktop version prior to 2.3, you're not going to be familiar with the metadata button. This was something we just launched this year in version 2.3 of the desktops. But what this allows us to do is actually define a metadata file that will be written out for whatever type of spatial data we're going to be creating. So in this case, we're writing out a seg file. If we're working elsewhere, if we're writing out a raster file or a vector format file, we've added this new metadata button throughout the desktop. So the metadata editor in here allows us to publish standard metadata files that we can use to work with in any of those data formats. So this is going to rely on a base template that we can define in here. If you have a base template that you wish to work with, we can put that in there. And then what this is going to do is fill out for us all of the standard FGDC metadata that's associated with a piece of spatial data. So there's a base template in here that gives us all of the places to fill out things like the identification information, any descriptions, and all of those various important pieces of the metadata that allow us to properly identify the coordinates, the source of the data, all of the little bits and pieces about the production of a particular piece of data. So once these are filled out in here, we can come through, we can fill out the abstract, the purpose, any of the relevant data in here. We can actually pipe that right out alongside our existing seg file. So I'll just bring up an example of that here on my desktop here. Give me just a second. Flip over to my desktop view, and in my output folder here, I've now created a new seg file. So there's my output seg file. You'll see along with that an accompanying XML file. And that XML file is that metadata. So this is a file that you can take off into other software packages that simply relies on the standard FGDC schema for working with spatial metadata files as well. So now back into the desktop here. That metadata file, again, just goes along with the output of the job. So here we've just done one conversion of a regular seg file, and we made a slight modification to that. So at this point, what I'm going to do is go up to the preferences. We're going to see under the options menu, you've got your typical preferences. We have a number of preferences in here relating to the various parts of the application, but the new area is specifically for the seismic survey format. So again, in here we're taking a look at some of the specifics related to the loading of those files. So we have a preference about the preview of the file that we're actually going to work with within the grid of the seismic survey conversion job that we've added in here. So we're loading in the first 50 records. You can obviously increase that if you want to see more records than that on screen. There's the setting about whether or not we're going to prompt you for working through the wizard every time we load one of these. And then the real meat and potatoes here is the actual format that we have added in here. And so there you're going to see those three standard formats for bringing these files in. And now the thing about these formats is it's possible to have a number of different file extensions that can be associated with the same structural format. Particularly an example here for segp1 files, I've seen extensions of SEG like we have as our default extension. I've also seen folks use the full .segp1 extension. I've seen folks call those SP1s. There's a number of little variations, and those are all going to feed right into the same scheme. But different companies working with different tools are sometimes going to have different flavors of those things. So the different extensions may come and go. One of the things we can do here is we can add extensions to those existing formats without having to fully redefine the import and export schemes for those. So let's say, for example, I'm working at a place and I regularly encounter seg files that are identified as a .sp1. I can come in here to the preferences for working with my seismic formats. I can come down to add extension, and I can simply punch in that sp1 extension. Now when I load any of those in there, both SEG and SP1 will be recognized as a standard flavor of the segp1 format itself. If we want to get a little bit more complicated, if we're going to deal with actual variants of the structure of those files, we can add new formats in here altogether. So when we do that, it's going to bring us back into that text wizard that we were just working through a minute ago with the seg file. Now, it starts you off with those 3 base types. And so let's say, for an example, I want to create a variant of the segp1 type that's going to handle the type of data that I just brought in, that seg file that had the slightly modified header in there. I can start off with segp1 as my base, and we can make a copy of that. And when you hit copy, it basically prompts you here for a new type. So I might call that segp1 with a, I'm just going to call this a mod header. So I'm going to call this a segp1 with a modified header. And we can bring in a preview of those files. So I'm going to go back into my directory where I'm storing these files. I'm going to grab that file I was working with just so I have something to base my scheme on. And I'm going to load that in there as my preview just so I have something to take a look at what these settings are going to total up to. I'll click over to the next where we deal with those headers. And so here, I'm going to make that logical block again back to 1 just to deal with this particular variation of those files. And I can scroll down to see what part of the file that's going to identify. I'll click Next to go over to our data records. And since there weren't any changes to make there, I don't need to do that. I can just inherit all of these normal standards from the seg file scheme that we started off with. So I'm going to remember all those column locations in here. And I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. And then in our job type here, we're now going to have a segp1 with a modified header. And if I select that, we'll see we can also add extensions in here for some of those different jobs. So in this case, let's say we have some of those that are identified by that other extension, the full segp1. So we would have a .segp1 file. I can go ahead and add that in there as my extension. Anytime I add that particular extension in there, it's going to recognize that as the modified flavor of the seg file that I've got. So now, since I've created this based on the segp1 initial standard, I can bring that in using this modified text scheme, and then I can actually write that out as a standard seg file. So that will come out with all the H's in their appropriate places in those logical blocks. And just to point that out, I'm actually going to pop open our output file here. So I'm going to open this up in the text editor, and you'll see now in the file, on those header records, there's only an H on every 20th row rather than on every single row. And then we get down into some empty space here where we run out of, there's actually some stuff missing from our typical logical block. But it fills up the appropriate area so that it can be read by software that expects the full standard scheme to be respected. Okay, that's one variation. And now I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and we're going to take a look at a piece of UCOA data for a little bit more complicated version of this. So I'm going to pop open a new file here, and this is a UCOA P190 file. And again, it asks us whether or not we want to just simply load this in using the standard scheme. And this is actually a standard file, but I'm going to quickly step through this just to identify how some of these changes are actually relevant in here, where we have different column structures for our shot points and receivers. So like I said, this is a standard file, but I'm not going to make any changes as we go through here. So I'm going to say no, let's not use the standard header. So it's identifying this as a UCOA P190 file. It's using the file I just specified as the preview, so that's great, we can move on. We're identifying our headers in here, and so the UCOA standard is to actually have an H on every single line of that header. So we'll see that it identifies our different information here. As we break down into the coordinate data, here's where we start to see some of those differences in the various rows as we deal with shots or receivers. I'll move on to the breakdown of the data records here. And so this is where we see we actually have different structures here for receivers and for shots. So our receivers are identified with an R at the beginning of every row of those, and that's pretty common. In that structure, we have 14 columns going across that file, and we have the various bits of data that are stored in those 14 different columns. If we move over and take a look at shot point identification in the file, you'll see there's a number of different identifiers at the beginning of those rows that all signify the various shot codes there. There's 15 columns, and we have different data columns as we go along through those columns. So if you take a look at where those red lines are being drawn on the columns here, you can see my latitudes are being isolated in their own column, my longitudes are isolated in their columns. The same with the eastings and northings in there. And then I'm going to flip this back over to the receivers, and we can notice how the columns change. All of those red lines are now isolating different rows of data. The yellow highlighting is highlighting the different rows that are recognized as receivers, and the red lines are showing for us the column breaks in there. So we're able to accommodate both structures of columns in one data file now. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and that's simply going to load this in here. I made no modifications to that standard scheme. And as we load that file back in, we can now see that we've got both our shot points and our receivers all in one common table here. Now what we do is we do actually break these out into their own columns. And for ease, we don't try to cram those all into different structures. What we're doing here is we highlight in the shade of gray, we see all of the receivers, and we see all the various shot points grouped in the white cells as well. So we see the different column structures that we have. I'm going to close my process manager at the bottom just to get a little more space on screen here. And we have our 3 pairs of columns that have our projected coordinates in our receiver records, and we have our latitude-longitude coordinates in the 8th and 9th columns of our shot rows, and we have our northings and eastings in the 10th and 11th columns in our shot rows there. So now, just like in the seg file that we were just working on, we also have some header data in here that we can preview in the header editor of that file. So we can open this up, and we can make some changes in there if we need to modify anything in that header. And the conversion, again, is also just like the conversion that we have on that seg data, except here we're actually going to be able to convert both the lat-longs and the northings and eastings along with the projected northings and eastings in both shot points and receivers in a single pass. So this is something that would take a lot of work to split the data apart into 2 groups, and then actually to convert the receiver records, this used to take us 3 passes. And we're able to do all 4 of those conversions in one step now, going down the file. So I'm going to convert basically everything in this file. I'm going to start off. I'm going to use the projected coordinate systems as the base of the conversion. What that's going to allow me to do is use the 9th and 10th columns in my shot point columns, and it's going to allow me to use all 3 sets of the northings and eastings in my receiver rows. In this particular data file, these happen to be in UTM zone 24 south, I believe. Excuse me. And I'm going to use that as the basis. So we know where all of those northings and eastings columns are. So we know they're in the 3rd and 4th, the 7th and 8th, and in the 11th and 12th in my receiver rows, and we know they're in the 9th and 10th columns in my shot rows. So that's identifying our input coordinate system. And on our output, if I wish to update both of those, I'm going to now toggle on to use both an output projected system and an output geodetic system. So I'm going to move that back over. Let's say we want to put this onto a UTM zone with a different datum. Just for simplicity here, I'm going to put these right back into to zone 24 south, just to stay simple for our example. And I'm going to then recalculate the WGS84 coordinate. Something possibly more common in here would be to actually introduce a datum transformation and move everything over to a new geodetic model as well. Just for example here, I'm going to keep it simple. Now the formats in here, we have format options for our outputs. So let's say we want to round off all of those decimals for output. We want to get rid of that last decimal place. We can put that down to 0. If we want to keep them, we can put that down to 1, since we actually have one place of precision in all of those coordinates. And our WGS84 coordinates here, we have the variation of the format that is typically called PACT-DMS with a dot. And if we choose our formats in there, we can move this over to the PACT-DMS. We can see our input is going to have PACT-DMS with a dot. And let's get rid of the dot. So we're going to call that PACT-DMS with no dot, and 2 places of precision for our output. Now again, we can go ahead and give this a file name, and I'm simply going to call that UCOA for our output, save that file name. And again, we can run a preview of that conversion if we want. We can then go ahead and run the process of the entire file. And there's back again with one of our little yellow errors down at the bottom. And this was one of the ones that I had left over on screen. I was just running through all of this beforehand. And so what this tells us is that we are now able to complete the entire file. But there were some rows that contained an error in the data. And so again, this goes back to some of the tools that we already had built in here for isolating problems that we have in some of the data formats. So if there's, for example, something out of whack in one of these coordinates, if we have millions and millions of coordinates stored in here, we need to figure out which one of those coordinates actually has the problem. And so to do that, again, I'll bring back our Messages panel. And what we can do here is I'm just going to pop this out to make it a little bit easier to read. We'll scroll to the bottom, and we can see that in this last conversion I've done, there's a problem in row 225, so 225 rows down from the top of that file. Column C11 is missing something, and it shows us that the data is actually blank in that column. So what I would need to do here would be to go back down through my UCOA file, the original data, and I could check that out. When it hits a blank coordinate, it's just simply not able to convert. So what we would either need to do is go down there, figure out why there's a blank, replace the data, or simply clean the data up. That would allow us to then go right back into the file and process the whole thing, hopefully coming out with a final, a green status of successfully finished the whole file for output. If we're doing a large batch of those, that's where the process manager starts to get handy in here. We can see some of the various jobs that we've run. If we're running a large batch, these are all going to have some different names. I've been working in the same job for a little bit now. And so we'll see some of those various success or failure statements. Those help us to isolate for batch interface. And so for those of you who are used to working with these, you're probably familiar with having more than one of these to do in a single pass. And just like we've had batch support in our point database conversions all along, we're also introducing batch support for this new seismic survey job that we're adding in here. And the way it functions is exactly the same as any of the other batch tools in here. All we have to do is right-click on that seismic survey conversion that we've set up in here. So we set one of these up as a template. And then all we have to do is come down and select Batch Add on that job. And what this needs from us is simply the type of data we're going to be working with here. And then we simply add in any of the other files that we've got. So I'm just going to grab onto my same file here. That pulls the file in. All of the coordinate system settings are displayed for us, but they're grayed out because we don't need to set those. They're inherited from our base template. We can use our typical name modifier tools in here for working with the output names. If we want to change the names of our batch files as we create them. The output format, again, very useful here. We can pick from any of those files that are built on the base standard. So if I was working with seg data here and I was bringing in data from any of those modified schemes that we have, I could bring in one of my modified schemes, and then I could write that back out as a standard version of that scheme. And then simply we need a location to write those out to, and it'll generate a batch for us here. So our batch, again, is going to show up just like any of our other batches. that we've been familiar with working with in desktop. You'll see a batch node that is going to group any of those multiple outputs, and then the individual jobs down at the bottom. So again, those can all be run in batch mode. It'll basically go through each one of those, working through any Foley that it can. We'll report back any errors through the messages panel and through the progress manager, just like we have for the point database conversion. So that's going to wrap it up for the introduction to our new seismic survey job. We'll take a look at some questions here. I understand Carl's been helping me out by answering some of the text questions as they have come in here. Back to any of the specifics on those. If we have any questions that folks would like to ask, you can use your the control, the webinar control that you have on usually on the upper right-hand side of your screen. There is a tool in there that allows you to raise your hand. If you would like to raise your hand, I can unmute your line and allow you to ask a voice question if you haven't had any time to get your question answered so far in the webinar. So let me give that just a second if any of you would like to ask a question. Okay, I see some of you are already starting to do that. So I'm going to unmute here the line forgive me if I don't pronounce this properly. I believe your name is Hua Liu. Do you have a question you'd like to ask? Hello, are you there, Hua? Okay, looks like that was an unintentional hand raising. If there is anybody else, I'll give it just another moment here on the line to raise your hand. Okay, it looks like everybody's had their questions answered via text as we've gone along here. Danielle, are you there as well?
I am still here, Sam.
Okay, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just want to thank everyone for participating today. We hope you found this information valuable and that we look forward to your comments and feedback before the release of the new desktop. As always, you can contact your sales representative at sales@bluemarblegeo.com for licensing questions, for future training sessions, or any other feedback you'd like to share with us. And always, you can contact the technical support team at geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com. Thanks again, everyone, for participating today. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, thanks, Danielle, and thank you to all of you who attended. We have been recording this, so if you would like to see it again, we hope to have that recording available shortly. This is the first webinar we've actually been able to record, so bear with us. It may take a day or two to get it into a format on our website for viewing, but we hope you liked the new screen sharing service we're working with here from those of you who have attended any of our webinars in the past. But again, thank you all for attending today. We look forward to seeing you next month at our next webinar. So thanks very much, everyone.